Todd, I want to congratulate you on this database. It's unfortunate that a vetting failures database needed to even be created, but you've done commendable work identifying numerous instances where terrorists, bad actors, and fraudsters were able to obtain U.S. immigration benefits that they should not have received. As was previously mentioned, I had the distinct honor of holding several leadership positions at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services during the Trump administration, which is the part of the Department of Homeland Security that administers the nation's lawful immigration system, including naturalization, adjustment of status to lawful permanent resident or green card status, a number of temporary guest worker programs, asylum, and refugee status. Some of these benefits go with an in-person interview. Others are just based off of the paper application or petition. This is also the agency that pursued a biometrics regulation that unfortunately was not finalized before the change of administrations, that if it had gone into effect would have empowered all aspects of the Department of Homeland Security, including CBP and ICE, to utilize and modernize all forms of biographic and biometric information for screening and vetting, a useful tool that unfortunately didn't make it across the finish line. This panel could not be timelier. Earlier this month marked the 20th anniversary of the creation of DHS. Congress created DHS in response to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks that killed nearly 3,000 Americans in New York City, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. While 9/11 is often thought of as an intelligence failure, and it was also an immigration failure. As the executive summary of the 9/11 Commission's report put it, quote, "The 9/11 attacks were a shock, but they should not have come as a surprise." Another quote from the executive summary is, and more precisely, "Protecting borders was not a national security issue before 9/11. For example, the 9/11 hijackers used passports that were fraudulently manipulated or contained indicators of extremism. They made detectable false statements on visa applications and to border agents to be allowed into the country, and they violated U.S. immigration laws while in the country. As the focus of today's panel demonstrates, the U.S. government remains plagued by the same screening and vetting failures that allowed 19 terrorists into our country 21 years ago to execute their deadly scheme. An illustrative example from Todd's report is the case of El Mehdi Semlahi Fathi. This Moroccan-born foreign national was allowed into the U.S. in 2007 on an F1 student visa. But he failed out of college after just one semester. Instead of departing the country, he remained here unlawfully. 2 years later, he was arrested for trespassing, transferred over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, custody, and put into removal proceedings. Now, of course, the fact that I'm mentioning him here today means that the story did not end with a prompt deportation in 2009. That's because he claimed that if he were returned to Morocco, he would be persecuted by the Moroccan government due to his student activist activities. Fathi was released from detention by an immigration judge in order to apply for asylum. While it's unclear when he was radicalized, if that was something that should have been detected at the student visa process time or at some point after that, the asylum claim was completely bogus, and it bought him the time that he needed to plot bombing attacks on federal buildings in the United States. Evidence of this fraud should have been detected, but he was still nonetheless granted asylum in 2013, putting him on an expedited path to U.S. citizenship. Fortunately, a separate FBI investigation resulted in his capture prior to his bombing plots materializing. In 2014, he pled guilty to perjury on his asylum application after the FBI, and not DHS, exposed the asylum fraud by, as one example, comparing the inconsistencies between his student visa application and his asylum application. In fact, the FBI even caught him on a recording bragging to someone about his fraudulent asylum application and it being approved. Just briefly, I will touch on another vetting failure that came from 2007 involving a Somali who was living in a Kenyan camp and seeking refugee status in the United States. What viewers may not know is that the primary vetting of refugees is conducted by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR. USCIS refugee officers then interview applicants who have passed the UNHCR screening. In this case, the foreign national lied about his tribal affiliation, essentially saying that he was from one part of Somalia and was with one particular clan and not the clan that he was actually a part of. In doing so, concealed or attempted to conceal that he was connected to a U.S. designated foreign terrorist organization. The fraud went undetected. He was granted refugee status and resettled in the United States in 2008, where he almost immediately began conspiring with terrorist organizations. A year later, the fraud was missed again when he was granted lawful permanent resident status. It wasn't until 2014 when an FBI counterterrorism investigation uncovered his ties to al-Shabaab and his immigration fraud. A federal judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison for the fraud and for supporting terrorism. Now, I chose to highlight these two cases because there are parallels to current Biden administration policies that are increasing the likelihood of more bad actors slipping through the cracks. In the first case, the alien filed a fraudulent asylum claim in order to delay his removal from the U.S. This, of course, is the very tactic that is being exploited by illegal aliens today that are apprehended at the southern border. When policies allow aliens to remain here for years and not be held in detention facilities for merely using buzzwords like asylum or credible fear, it incentivizes fraudulent, frivolous, and otherwise non-meritorious claims. Some are doing it for economic reasons, but there are also bad actors in that pile as well. This in turn overwhelms the system in the development of so-called backlogs. As pressure comes down from the top to clear these backlogs, and that's whether we're talking about asylum or lawful immigration benefits, adjudicators are pressured and put under unrealistic quotas to hit. This incentivizes more approvals because these are less burdensome outcomes than denials, which require the creation of a separate memo explaining why the benefit is being denied. The second case is interesting for several reasons. First, it was my impression from my time at USCIS that the Refugee Corps was too reliant on UNHCR, too deferential. Now, while UNHCR does play a helpful role in rooting out some meritless and ineligible claims, at the end of the day, a non-governmental entity should not be the leader of the screening and vetting for any population that is being allowed into the United States. Additionally, this case involved a foreign national from a failed state, in this case, Somalia. This makes any document inherently more difficult to verify and identities easy to mask. The locking in of his bogus background is similar to what we are currently dealing with as a result of the Biden administration's unlawful Operation Allies Welcome parole program, which allowed around 100,000 unvetted and visaless Afghans into the U.S. after the botched withdrawal from Kabul. Scathing OIG reports from both the Department of Defense and DHS have found that the Biden administration ordered federal employees to accept at face value any story that these Afghan nationals were telling them. For example, there are a disproportionate number of them who have a January 1st birthday, because that was the date that they were told to put into the systems, the federal government identity systems, if no other date was provided. Briefly returning to the 9/11 Commission's report, it stated very concisely, the nation was unprepared. Sadly and concerningly, we seem to have reverted to a September 10th, 2001 mindset. The adjudicators that I met with at USCIS want to get each case right. The failures materialize from expansionist immigration policies that create unreasonable workloads and unfair expectations to adjudicate quickly. I would argue that it is far better from a national security and immigration integrity standpoint for the adjudicators to be empowered to take the time they need to feel 100% confident in each outcome. I look forward to a constructive dialogue about screening and vetting failures and the policies and tools needed to protect the homeland.